Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of The Chocolate Life Live. My name is Clay Gordon. I'm the creator and the moderator of TheChocolateLife.com. And I want to welcome everybody who's joined me today for this live stream. I want to remind everyone that you can go into the comments, the live chat, whether on YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, and anytime you can throw in a question about anything that I'm talking about. I will get the question up on the screen. I will get it asked and answered. And please, just let me know where you are, in fact, connecting from today, where it is you're watching from today. So, and I will also give a shout out to everyone who lets me know where they're connecting from. We have an international audience, and it's always nice to acknowledge where people are coming from. So with that basic bit of stuff out of the way, I want to go and start by letting everybody know, hey, this is the homepage of TheChocolateLife.com right now. And I want to let everybody know that for every single one of these live streams that I put together an individual post. And so you can go to the website, you can click on the name of a post, and it will open up. And this is the post for today's live stream. I try to show off today's live stream. And what you'll do is you'll find my thoughts, why it is that I'm doing this. You'll find I've embedded the video that I will be playing as part of the deconstruction of the Epicurious Guide to Chocolate. So I posted this yesterday, so perhaps you've had an opportunity to watch that video. And then my thoughts some more, as well as some links to some other resources. So these are all here on TheChocolateLife.com right now. So if you are a member, what you can do is you can go to the end and you can add some comments, which are greatly appreciated. What I also did for today, which is a little bit unusual, I'm trying something out, is I created this sort of graphic, right? So I'm sort of deconstructing what it is that's going on. I'm trying to organize my thoughts and put things together. And so I've created this little graphic. I'm going to export this graphic either as an image or as a PDF or something like that, and I'm going to embed it on the page. And that's one of the reasons why I have a post for every single one of these live streams, is if there's anything that's brought up during the live stream, I'll be able to put it on that page as a resource. So that's where we are today. So, So I titled this Deconstructing the Epicurious Guide to Chocolate, or the Epicurious Guide to Chocolate Deconstructed. And I had an opportunity to ask over on YouTube a couple of weeks ago whether people wanted reaction videos. Reaction videos seem to be very popular here on the internet. And, not many people responded to the post, and not many people were really excited about the idea of reaction videos. How do you do a reaction video how do you do a reaction to a video about chocolate? But I thought what was really, really important here is that, Epicurious is an extremely well-known resource when it comes to food and cooking. It is a very, very highly respected resource when it comes to food and cooking. I mean, a good colleague of mine, a friend, Michael Lyskonis, who's the head of the Chocolate Lab, and as well as the director of education at the Institute for Culinary Education, is featured on Epicurious programming. So I wanted to make sure, when I looked at this, and I was immediately drawn to it, is this sounds really, really interesting, because the first thing that they point out in this is that there are 15 different kinds of chocolate, 15 different types of chocolate. I mean, this is boom, right into it. And I thought really hard before I actually clicked through the video, and I said, how could there possibly be 15 different types of chocolate? So I'm aware of 3 types of chocolate: dark milk and white. Barry Callebaut, with the introduction of Ruby in 2017, has been lobbying for the creation of a 4th type of chocolate. And so I was sort of wondering, what's been going on in the world of chocolate in the last couple of years, that the number of different types of chocolate might have gone from 4 to more than 15 without my noticing it. And so that was my original thought. And as I got into this, I realized that there was a lot that not only did I not disagree, there was a lot that I did not agree with. So I disagreed with a lot of it, but I thought that there was some outright wrong information in the video. And so I thought it would make sense to go through it and provide a response to these specific points that are brought up in this video for the reasons that are, if you as a follower of the Chocolate Life, or you as a professional who are working to educate anybody about cocoa and chocolate around the world, that if people come to you with questions, they're going to see this video. If they have particularly held beliefs about things, it's going to undermine some of them in a bad way. It's going to accentuate some of them in a bad way. And what I want to do is I want to point out what they get really, really right and what I really do agree with. But what I also want to do is talk a little bit about what I think they don't get right. And with that, I haven't watched the whole video. I've watched parts of it. And so I'm going to get started with this, and I am going to stop and start and play and let it go and interrupt and we'll see how it goes. This is an experiment for me. It's the first time I've ever done one of these things live. So I'm glad to have you along for the ride.
There are over 15 different types of chocolate. I'm going to show you how to identify and correctly use all of the different types of chocolate that you might encounter. Cacao beans. Cacao beans are pretty much the most raw version of chocolate that you can buy. The cacao beans are taken from the pod growing on the tree. They're fermented and dried, and that's exactly what you see here. The cacao tree is thought to have originated in the upper Amazon region, and then the growth of the tree spread to Central and South America. To make chocolate, these beans would have to first be roasted and then processed and ground to be turned into chocolate.
So this is where I think I have to step in and make my first observation, is that Chef Cheatham, I'm just going to refer to her as Chef from now on. Chef says that cacao beans are a form of chocolate, and then says that the cacao beans must be roasted and then ground, processed into chocolate. And I don't think you can have both of those things. I mean, if we were to go and look at the standards of identity, and they're linked to on the Chocolate Life, we'll go look at the standards of identity, we'll find out that there are names for cacao, and those names for cacao are not associated with chocolate. And so somebody's coming to this and saying, oh, cacao beans, and cacao beans are a type of chocolate. No, cacao beans are an ingredient. And that cacao beans need to be processed in order to be able to turn into a form of chocolate. So just the first place to go there.
That's a lot of work.
Yes, it is a lot of work.
There's a thin layer of skin. It's almost like an almond skin. It's definitely very dry, but it is easy to break. You definitely get notes of acidity, bitterness, but a lot of depth of flavor. It's almost that feeling of like umami that kind of takes over your.
So this is really interesting to me. Umami is an interesting way to characterize the flavor of cocoa beans. And I don't know if she's working with raw cocoa beans there or roasted cocoa beans. It's not clear. I think she's working with raw cocoa beans. And any acidity that's coming is from the fermentation process that's associated with the beans. That, acetic acid, which is created as a part of fermentation, is not dried out. Or is not evaporated out during the drying process. Some beans are acidic and some beans aren't. So setting this up is, you're going to get an acidic taste on all beans. I'm not entirely sure that's a good place to go. But there is a depth of flavor. I wouldn't characterize the flavor as particularly chocolatey before the beans are roasted.
Your mouth, I think the skin has more bitterness than the inside.
Yes, it does.
I actually love chocolate in this form because you really get the essence of what the cacao is without adding things to it.
Okay. So I think that's a very, very important point to make. I mean, I wouldn't call it chocolate, so I don't think it's wrong. But I think that, especially as professionals, understanding the transformation. Here are the raw beans, here are the roasted beans. Here's what it tastes like when we can take the nibs and we turn them into liquor. Understand the progression of flavors from a bean, right, to a chocolate makes an enormous amount of sense. So I think this point is really good, is that we can get rooted in what the transformation of flavors is like over time.
You probably wouldn't eat cacao beans on their own, but they are great to infuse into different liquids to get.
Okay. Here I have to disagree. If you want to infuse anything, if you've got whole cacao beans in their shell, I mean, the liquid, whatever you're infusing, has got to go through the shell into the bean and then extract the flavor out of the beans. So if you want to infuse, you do that with nibs. You wouldn't do it with beans. I disagree completely with Chef here.
Get that flavor. You could make chocolate vodka or steep them into teas and really get that true essence of cacao. Cacao nibs. Cacao nibs, also called cocoa nibs, are dried, broken pieces of cacao beans. They can come roasted or unroasted. Typically, the roasted ones have a little more flavor and less of the bitterness.
Absolutely. That nibs, especially if they're roasted, will have a different flavor. But I don't necessarily know that I would necessarily characterize that there would be less bitterness. Bitterness is a function, among other things, of roasting. And so if I were to over roast the beans, they would be burnt and they would be bitter. So there is that. And I do want to do a shout out to Barbie Van Horn, who's connected from Seattle today. Barbie, yes, you would eat cacao beans on their own. Absolutely. I have eaten cacao beans on their own. I've also eaten whole cacao beans in their shell, which have been enrobed in various layers of chocolate and stuff like that. And so it can be a yummy, yummy, yummy experience, assuming that you have a good quality bean. So absolutely. I also want to point out that there is a misconstrual, I think, of what cacao is and what cocoa is. So we go from cacao beans, and then the cacao beans are used in a particular kind of way, and then we get to other things further down, like cocoa powder. And what is the transformation between cacao and cocoa? I'm not certain if a chef goes into that. Just for me, the way I recommend that people think about the differences between cacao and cocoa is that I use cacao whenever I'm talking about something that is fresh. So I'm talking about cacao trees, cacao pods, cacao seeds. And the moment it comes into the fermentation and drying stages, it becomes cocoa, right? And then, so we have cocoa beans, and the cocoa beans get converted into cocoa nibs and liquor and butter and powder and all those things. So that's my differentiation for how to use cacao over cocoa. It's useful for me. You may or may not want to do it that way. The reason why I mention it is that there is a part of the raw foods community or health food superfood community that talks about the differences between cacao and cocoa, and cacao is more healthy than cocoa is. And that's not necessarily the case. They're just different words for what I think of as different phases of the process of conversion of the whole bean into a derivative or finished product.
Cacao nibs are great to add to baked goods, placed on top of yogurt or ice cream, and also in smoothies.
I would add they're great in salads as well. A crunchy element in salads, it's a fabulous, fabulous way to use cacao nibs or cocoa nibs.
My favorite uses for cacao nibs is granola. I love adding cacao nibs to granola because they don't add any additional sweetness, but they add tons of flavor and texture. The chocolate making process essentially goes something like this. Cacao beans are broken down into nibs. The nibs are ground finely into a paste. The paste gets melted into what's called chocolate liquor, and then the liquor gets distributed to make the various types of chocolate.
Okay, so I want to say that technically there's no difference between cocoa paste and cocoa liquor, or chocolate cocoa paste or cocoa mass and liquor. They are in fact the same things. The word liquor means liquid, right? It's an old archaic term for fluid or liquid, and that's why we use the term liquor. It has nothing to do with alcohol, of course, but I don't grind the nibs into paste and melt them into liquor, right? Paste and liquor are the same thing.
Unsweetened chocolate.
Okay, so unsweetened chocolate is another term for liquor, or paste. Unsweetened chocolate is just ground up cocoa nibs with nothing else added to them. And as a matter of fact, there is an entry in the standard of identity for chocolate, so CFR 21.163, which talks specifically about liquor and unsweetened chocolate. Now, Chef is going to be talking about baker's chocolate specifically here. And it's important to know that when we get to a baking chocolate or a baker's chocolate, yes, it is higher in acidity, and the texture is a little coarser than we would want for a couverture chocolate, something which was designed for enrobing or molding. And the reason why is that I only have to get the particle size down below the particle size of flour. And if it's below the particle size of flour, it's not going to be, I can't taste it on my tongue. And the acidity is there because it's going to react with whatever leavening agent you're using. So that's why baker's chocolate tastes the way it does. It's slightly gritty, it's quite acidic, and that's because it's made for baking and not for eating.
Unsweetened chocolate is also commonly referred to as baking chocolate. It has no sugar added and is frequently used in baking. Unsweetened chocolate is the ground cocoa mass or paste that is then melted into chocolate liquor and set into bars. It is about equal parts cocoa butter and cocoa solids. It can be very bitter. It has
Okay, so it's non-fat cocoa solids. Technically, cocoa butter is solid at room temperature, so it's also a cocoa solid. So we refer to what we think of as cocoa powder as a non-fat cocoa solid.
absolutely no sugar added, and that's why it's used more commonly for baking instead of snacking.
Oh.
It's a little bitter, but you still get some of the acidity of the chocolate, a lot of tannins. This is a very pure form of chocolate, so this is what you want to use when you're making a devil's food cake or a chocolate stout cake. Ooh, it is intense. Another great use for unsweetened chocolate is your classic chocolate brownies. The sugar almost acts like salt in a recipe where it brings out the nuance of flavor. So you get some more of those citrus notes, you get some more of that luscious chocolate flavor.
Okay, so citrus notes is interesting here because not all cocoa beans when they're transformed into chocolate have any citrus notes in them. So I don't specifically know what beans she's referring to here. So if she's using baker's chocolate, I don't know where citrus notes come from. Not something I've ever detected.
But not overpowered by the bitterness of the raw chocolate. Milk chocolate. Milk chocolate contains at least 12% milk and a minimum of 10% cocoa mass. The added milk takes the edge off of the bitterness and tannic qualities of chocolate. Milk chocolate is very popular for snacking, and you'll commonly see it sold in the candy aisle under brands like Hershey, Nestle, and Cadbury. The texture on this is much softer. It doesn't have that same kind of bite and crispness as when you're biting into a piece of dark chocolate. So you do lose some of that texture because of the milk.
Okay, so she goes into milk chocolate before she goes into dark chocolate. So she went from baking chocolate into milk chocolate before going into dark chocolate. It's an interesting segue to that. It would have made more sense for me to go from unsweetened chocolate into dark chocolate into milk chocolate. But we'll see where she's going with this.
But it also makes it sweeter. You do get chocolate flavor, but you're not getting some of those characteristic bitter notes that you get from semi-sweet or bittersweet or unsweetened chocolate. Milk chocolate is great to use for things like chocolate pudding and chocolate mousse because the extra added milk and milk fat in here give it a creamier texture when it's melted. Semi-sweet chocolate. Semi-sweet chocolate begins with unsweetened chocolate that then has sugar added to it. It's used in sweet baking applications. You may have seen bittersweet chocolate and semi-sweet chocolate next to each other, but they're actually pretty much the same thing, with the determination being left up to the manufacturer on what to call it. Semi-sweet.
So that is absolutely correct. I mean, there is one category here, which is called sweet chocolate. And both semi-sweet chocolate and bittersweet chocolate fit into this one category of sweet chocolate. And there's no legal distinction between the two. There's no differentiation in the Code of Federal Regulations that differentiates what bittersweet chocolate is from what semi-sweet chocolate is. They both fit into the category of what is called sweet chocolate. And in general, I mean, the way to figure it out is to go look on the back, and if you can calculate, where sugar is in the recipe, and if you can get the percentage of calories which are associated with added sugar. So if you look at the added sugar in the recipe, you'll be able to tell which one is going to be sweeter, likely sweeter than another one, whether it's semi-sweet or bittersweet.
Chocolate has to have a minimum of 35% cocoa mass in it. However, the range usually falls between 65 and 70%. It's not too sweet, but it has just enough sugar to kind of offset the bitterness. It's great in baking, especially things like granola bars or even in pancakes, because it's not so sweet combined with a sweet batter. But
It's also important to know that here's what she's doing. She's talking about chocolate chips. right? And chocolate chips are formulated in very, very differently from a chocolate which is designed specifically for enrobing or molding applications, because the chocolate chips need to hold their shape when they are heated to a temperature beyond the melting point of cocoa butter. Now, if it's a real chocolate chip, there won't be any other fat in it, like a fractionated palm kernel oil. If you have, baking morsels and they say chocolatey, you have to look to see if they're 100% cocoa butter or not on the back. But often this is done by using a powdered something like dextrose or something in that family, a maltodextrin or something like that, which will absorb moisture and it will help the chip keep its shape during baking. So we need to determine if she does say that they're used for baking applications, which means we want the chips to retain their shape.
It is also great in chocolate chip cookies.
Yay.
Because they're not overly sweet, so they really balance out the cookie dough. I mean, come on, what's not to love? German's chocolate. German's chocolate is actually not from Germany. It was invented in 1852 by a man named Samuel German who worked for the Baker's Chocolate Company. He made it by incorporating more sugar than usual into semi-sweet chocolate. While German's chocolate is a variety of chocolate, it is trademarked and only ever sold under the Baker's brand.
So technically here is that it's not a type of chocolate because it's not listed in the Code of Federal Regulations. So it is a trademarked term for one company. And generically, we might talk about German chocolate cake or things like that. And this is a chocolate. So this fits into the category of what is called sweet chocolate. If we were to look very carefully at the label, it would probably say sweet chocolate somewhere on the label. So this is just it's not a type of chocolate on its own. It's an adjective, Germans. It's an adjective which describes a chocolate that is sweeter than normal within the category of what is called sweet chocolate.
That's definitely sweet. I wouldn't swap it out for regular semi-sweet because it would give you a sweeter finished product. While this is a product of the Baker's Chocolate Company, it does have specific uses, like chocolate frosting and, of course, German chocolate cake. Here we have German chocolate cupcakes topped with pecan coconut frosting.
I second that.
You can definitely taste the sweetness in the chocolate. It's not overly sweet, but that's balanced out by the recipe calling for less sugar than you would add to a chocolate cake that uses unsweetened chocolate. You get a lot of the deep.
And that's actually a really, really important point here for anybody who's baking and working with chocolate for baked applications, is that you can swap out an unsweetened chocolate with a bittersweet chocolate, with a semi-sweet chocolate, with a German's chocolate, by altering the amount of sugar that's used in the rest of the recipe. So very, very simple calculations that can be done. So if the recipe calls for semi-sweet chocolate and all you've got is bittersweet chocolate, then you can alter the amount of sugar, which, keep in mind, in baking is the same as a liquid. So you need to think about the other ratios that are going on, but you can swap out the various different types of chocolates and the inherent sweetness in the chocolate, right? You have to be very careful, however, if you are using unsweetened chocolate and there is a leavening agent, and then you replace that unsweetened chocolate with a semi-sweet or a German's chocolate, it may not have the same acidity. And so whatever it is you're making may not rise the same way.
Notes and toasted flavor of chocolate, and it's really nicely balanced out by coconut and pecan frosting, which is the traditional frosting for German chocolate cakes.
Yeah.
Dark chocolate. There is a wide range of dark chocolate. Sometimes you'll see dark chocolate compared against milk chocolate, but the main difference is...
So the point I want to make here is that there is no legal definition for dark chocolate, just as there is no legal distinction between sweet chocolate and bittersweet chocolate, or semi-sweet chocolate and bittersweet chocolate. What we call dark chocolate fits into the category of sweet chocolate. They're all the same thing, right? So what is interesting about this is that what we think of as dark chocolate colloquially is that dark chocolate contains no dairy ingredients. And that, in fact, is not the case. If you look at the standard of identity, and again, there's a link on the post for this live stream on the Chocolate Life. If you look at the standard of identity for sweet chocolate, you'll find that a lot of different kinds of dairy ingredients are, in fact, allowed into, excuse me, what we would think of as a dark chocolate. One of them might be anhydrous milk fat or butter oil, and that is used to slow down crystallization. It also reduces bloom. So the chocolate will stay on the shelf longer. It will stay in edible condition longer. Now, what you can't do is you can't add ingredients that mimic the flavor of butter or mimic the flavor of milk. But you can add dairy ingredients into what we think of as dark chocolate. So you have to be careful and look at the ingredients label on the back. If you have a dairy issue, or right, you want to stay away from any dairy products for other reasons, that in fact the dark chocolate doesn't contain any dairy ingredients.
Dark chocolate does not have any added milk.
Well, it may not have any added milk. That does not mean it doesn't have added dairy products. Right? That's a very, very important distinction.
Having that milk added gives dark chocolate a snappier, firmer texture, and also has some of those more bitter, chocolatey, tannic notes. The percentages can range, but dark chocolate has to have a minimum of 35% cocoa mass. Dark chocolate is made with different amounts of sugar and different percentages of cocoa mass. These different amounts of cocoa mass and sugar change the flavor and the texture of each type of dark chocolate. As you can see, I have a variety.
Right, and I would throw added cocoa butter into the recipe if there is in fact any added cocoa butter. So when we talk about cocoa content, it is in fact the combination of any cocoa mass that's used plus any added cocoa butter in the recipe. So that's a little nuance which is missed, which is important if you are in fact a professional using the chocolate for anything which requires enrobing. Or shelling or anything like that.
Of 4 different types of dark chocolate and percentages in front of me. And each one has a different amount of sugar and cocoa mass in them. On the lower end of the percentage, I'm getting more sweetness, less of the bitter notes, less of that robust chocolate flavor. It's more rounded and easy to eat, melts pretty quickly on your palate. And on the higher end of the percentage spectrum, I'm getting more bitterness and spice almost. As the percentages go up, one of the biggest things that you'll notice is that the texture of the chocolate itself gets firmer and also more brittle. So it'll break with more of a snap. It also takes long.
Well, that's entirely dependent upon the recipe. I can go to an 85% and increase the cocoa content above a certain point. I can keep increasing the cocoa content. The cocoa butter content. So cocoa butter as a percentage is a higher ratio than it might normally be. And so the texture is not necessarily linear. There's no direct correlation. I can say that if I'm making a 2-ingredient chocolate, no added cocoa butter, then yes, there probably is a direct correlation between doing a 60% and 85%. But if I can go in and add cocoa butter to the recipe, it's not a straight line correlation that the higher the cocoa content, the crisper, the crunchier the chocolate is going to be.
Longer to melt on your tongue because of that higher cocoa mass percentage. The flavor gets.
And so here she's conflating cocoa mass with cocoa mass and cocoa butter combined. And I think this will be confusing for a bunch of people who have a partial understanding of what it is that's going on.
It's much more intense. The sweetness goes down dramatically, but you get this really robust chocolate flavor. It's almost like hints of espresso. The higher percentage is definitely something that you want to linger and savor as opposed to just eating and going.
Yeah, I'm doing a close look at the bar. So obviously I cannot tell what it is that the 60% is, who a chef has chosen or the research team has chosen to be part of the demonstration. But obviously the 85% is a Valrhona Fev.
Going on about your day. As chocolate gets to a higher percentage, you'll also frequently notice this white bloom on the outside.
Bloom has nothing to do with cocoa percentage. It has to do with tempering. Right, so this is completely wrong. The reason why the Fevs have this this visual appearance is that because they are put in bags, and these pieces rub up against each other during the course of manufacturing, packaging, shipping, and transportation from the store to the home, and as you're moving things around. So this is not necessarily fat bloom. I would just say, oh, this looks like it's a bit of chocolate. It could be fat bloom, but this also could be a piece that had been handled very roughly, a lot of scuffing with the other pieces in the bag. Whereas if I'm a bar and I saw that on it, I would go, oh, this is likely to be fat bloom. But there is no direct relationship between cocoa content, right, and bloom, right? It's a function of tempering and handling.
That does not mean that your chocolate went bad, so don't be scared and don't throw it away. That white powdery substance on the outside is called fat bloom. That's when your chocolate reacts to a fluctuation in temperature, either being too cold or too warm and then coming back to room temperature. The cocoa butter solids.
Actually, it has to get hot and then cool down, right? You don't get bloom from it being cooled and then coming up to room temperature. Although you might shock it in a high humidity environment, that may cause bloom, but most of the time it's chocolate getting too warm and then cooling down too quickly.
Will actually come to the surface and create this kind of white haziness on the outside. Mexican table chocolate. Mexican table chocolate is a type of chocolate used for cooking that's made by grinding cocoa nibs with coarse sugar and a little bit of cinnamon. The little bit of cinnamon added to this type of chocolate gives it that distinctive warm spice note.
Right. So here's where I have to jump in and think that this particular video goes off the rails, right? So, and I think of Mexican chocolate as a stand-in for all of the various kinds of what I think of as rustic chocolate. So I can go to Sicily and get bars from Antica Dolceria Boniuto, or I can get them for Doña Maria Echeverria. Right, Doña Echeverria. And these are very coarse crystal sugar and coarsely ground chocolate. They can be eaten. They're not really designed to be eaten. They're designed to be melted into hot water or hot milk. So I don't think of Mexican chocolate as a type of chocolate. I think it's because number one is there's no standard of identity that says Mexican chocolate has got to have these ingredients in it in order to be called Mexican chocolate. And the characterization that these only contain cinnamon is untrue because many typical chocolates in this style, especially in Oaxaca, also have almonds in them and may have vanilla ground into them as well. So just characterizing this as nibs and sugar and cinnamon is to not understand and not respect the complexity that Mexican style chocolate can have. You know, if you are a big fan of crunchy chocolate and things like that, I mean, and you want the bright sweetness that comes with having whole sugar crystals in what you're doing, and Mexican chocolate's a great thing to have. But it's not a separate type of chocolate. It is taking a cocoa mass and then adding other ingredients in it to sweeten and flavor it.
That you taste when you have Mexican hot chocolate and moles. While it looks like a chocolate that would be for snacking, it has a much deeper and robust flavor, which is why it's primarily used for cooking. In some regions, the skin on the cocoa bean is left intact when it's ground.
That's illegal in the United States. And it's illegal in most parts of the world. It may be done in Mexico, but it's not something that would pass inspection in the United States. And anything that is imported into the United States that is called Mexican chocolate will have been made from nibs for which no skin. I mean, the maximum amount of shell in chocolate is 1.75% by weight in the nibs, right? So, you know, there have been people who have tried this, and it's a bad idea. If the shell has not been debacterialized, you could get Salmonella and E. coli on the skins. It tastes in chocolate, if you have a very high percentage of shell, and I've had some before, it tastes like rancid Parmesan cheese. It's not a flavor I think that anybody wants. Well, at least the samples I tasted had an overtone of rancid Parmesan cheese. I don't think that's something anybody wants, especially in their Mexican chocolate.
To give it a little bit more of that bitter flavor. That's pretty delicious. The chocolate flavor is very deep, dark, robust. It tastes like this one definitely had the skin left on the bean to get those bitter notes. It has a...
If it's in the United States, it does not have shells left on it. It would be illegal. It would be confiscated. It would be banned from sale in the United States.
A little bit more of a tannic flavor, a slight bit of acidity, and really cool texture from the spices ground into it. You can also feel the texture of the coarse sugar, and you can actually see some of the crystals inside. So if you are to eat it on its own, you will get some of that crunchiness from the sugar. This is chicken with mole. Mole is a traditional sauce that varies widely by region and household, but some versions of it use Mexican table chocolate like mole negro.
Okay, so mole negro is literally what it says. It's a black mole. So mole generally just means mixture. So, and when we think about the chocolate version of mole, it's only mole poblano. Poblano doesn't mean it has poblano peppers in it. It means it comes from Puebla. The mole negro, amarillo, coloradito, and other ones are Oaxacan. And most of those, and I don't think any of the traditional Oaxacan moles actually have cacao in them in any form. So they wouldn't have cacao beans ground into them. They wouldn't have cacao paste in them. And they wouldn't have necessarily, if they did have that, wouldn't have prepared chocolate in them. They would have taken the individual spices and prepared the individual spices in a way that was specific to that recipe. In modern times, as a shortcut, if we're trying to do something, yes, we might use a prepared chocolate like this, but traditionally, no, not at all. And not in a classic mole negro. I can't remember seeing a classic mole negro recipe that has any form of cacao in it, let alone Mexican spiced table chocolate.
The Mexican table chocolate gives it this distinct warm flavor and also the deep, rich color that you see.
Yeah, I don't doubt that, but it wouldn't be traditional mole negro.
You get so much rich depth of flavor in this sauce, balanced really well by some warm chilies, a little bit of ground sesame. So it takes the edge off the sweetness, but you're still getting so much of that umami and deep flavor from the chocolate in there. Modeling chocolate. Modeling chocolate is used by bakers and confectioners to make chocolate decorations. It's a mixture of melted chocolate and corn syrup, and it makes this pliable dough that kind of feels like Play-Doh. Modeling chocolate reacts with the heat of your hands and gets more pliable and easier to work with as it warms up. And you can see that it almost looks like a pie crust or other kind of...
Okay, so this is edible. It's just chocolate, right? And corn syrup, right? In a ratio to get something which is malleable, something which can be warmed up and moved and formed and turned into decorations. But it's not a type of chocolate, right? It's an application of chocolate. So I take a base chocolate, in this case, an unsweetened chocolate, right? And I add, right, a sweetener ingredient to it, and I create something for an application. But it's not a type of chocolate. You won't go into the standards of identity and say, oh, modeling chocolate must contain X and Y and Z in order to be considered modeling chocolate. It's not the way we think about things.
Dough that you can work with very easily. This is so fun.
Oh, it is a lot of fun. I mean, playing with modeling chocolate, making modeling chocolate.
It's almost like eating a Tootsie Pop or Tootsie Roll. It's exactly what it's like. It has a chewy, dissolving texture that's a little weird. So it goes away a little bit faster than a Tootsie Roll does, but you still get that same kind of sticking to your teeth.
If you were to use a cooked syrup, a cooked sugar syrup, and mix chocolate into it, you'd actually get something which is closer to a Tootsie Roll. Maybe throw some sweetened condensed milk in there as well. You'd get something. I mean, if you can make a traditional brigadeiro recipe, Brazilian brigadeiro recipe, which is just butter, usually it's cocoa powder, but you can use chocolate, and sweetened condensed milk. If you boil it down far enough and let it cool, you will have something that's almost identical to a Tootsie Roll.
Teeth candy feeling, but it's great for making beautiful decorations like chocolate roses. Isn't that pretty?
That is true.
As you see here, the modeling chocolate can be rolled out really thinly, cut and shaped into just about anything you want. And it's actually easier to work with than sugar fondant, so it's preferred by a lot of bakers and cake decorators to make intricate designs.
Right.
The corn syrup adds a lot of sugar, but also pliability to this. So that's the key here, is that you're going for something that you can work with and shape to whatever you want to make. Couverture chocolate. Couverture chocolate is the preferred type of chocolate used in tempering. Couverture chocolate is made by grinding the...
I just got to say, it is the preferred kind of chocolate used in tempering. Just is a complete misunderstanding of what tempering is. Any commercial chocolate that is sold, whether it's a milk chocolate bar, a white chocolate bar, a dark sweet chocolate bar, whatever it is, any particular chocolate that's out there is going to be tempered. There's very little chocolate in any form that is sold untempered, right? So what's going on here is a couverture chocolate is a chocolate of a specific fluidity, right? Usually through added cocoa butter into the recipe, so that when you use it to enrobe or to form a shell, right, you you can get something which is very, very thin. Couverture is from the French word couvre, which means cover, right? And so that's where it comes from, right? Tempering is something that every chocolate that I have ever worked with, apart from if I'm blocking something that's coming out of a grinder or melanger, so a paste, I may not temper a chocolate liquor. But there's no direct relationship. Couverture chocolate is not for tempering. Tempering is for all chocolate. It's that's not the definition of couverture. And I can have a milk chocolate couverture, a white couverture, a sweet chocolate or dark chocolate couverture. It's not related to any particular type of chocolate, right? It's just a description of the fluidity of the chocolate, right? And it turns out that almost all of the chocolate bars, the solid chocolate bars that get eaten, right, which are more than 2 ingredients, so there's added cocoa butter in it, technically would qualify as couverture. Although I believe in the European regulations, there is a minimum cocoa butter content or a minimum fat content in order for something to be considered couverture. In the US, there's no minimum cocoa butter requirement for something to be classified as a couverture. We think of it colloquially, right? And you can look on the back of a bag of most chocolate, and they will give you a fluidity level, usually in terms of 1, 2, 3, 4 drops or something like that. If you're not clear about that, you can go to the manufacturer and get what is called an MSDS, a material safety data sheet, and it will tell you, more precisely what the amount of cocoa butter that's in the beans is, the amount of fat that's in the beans, and how much added cocoa butter there is. So if you're at all concerned about any of these things, please go to the distributor, go to the manufacturer, and find out what the exact things are. But this characterization of tempering and couverture is entirely wrong.
Chocolate to a finer paste, and it has a higher percentage of cocoa butter.
Well, it's true, it has a higher percentage of cocoa butter, but the particle size is going to be the same as most other chocolates, except for a raw mass before it goes through the process.
Percentage of cocoa butter gives it a beautiful glossy finish when it cools. The flavor on this is really incredible. Because of that extra cocoa butter, it gives a really nice mouth feel and texture. It's creamy, it's soft, it melts a little bit easier than dark or bittersweet chocolate, but it's not overly sweet. This type of chocolate.
So again, I could have a 33% cocoa content white chocolate, couverture. There is no correlation whatsoever between something being a couverture and its level of sweetness.
Is great for melting because of the fine texture and high fat content.
Okay. Texture has nothing to do with it. They're all going to be ground to somewhere below 20 microns and maybe down to 12 to 15. And yes, it is the cocoa butter content. The more cocoa butter, the higher the fluidity, the fattier the mouthfeel. All of these kinds of things are going to contribute to it. But it's this characterization is wrong.
It makes it great to cover anything like truffles, bonbons, eclairs in a beautiful shell of chocolate.
Right. And we'd also be using the couverture, we're probably using the same chocolate for the ganache center of those things, right? So calling about as a couverture for covering things without also saying we use the same chocolate for pretty much everything. We might use a different percentage of chocolate. We might use a different recipe, different origin, all these kinds of things, different producing country. But functionally, her description of couverture here is not right.
It's also great for things like chocolate dipped strawberries. You can see here that even when it's melted, it has a beautiful glossy shine to it. And that shine is coming from all the extra cocoa butter fat in there. You can see that even after it cools, the chocolate has a beautiful sheen to it. And you can feel that like nice, perfect, snappy texture.
I'd like to see what that looks like 8 hours from now or 2 days from now. I mean, if the chocolate is properly tempered after it was melted, or if it was as it was melted, it was never taken out of temper, it would stay in temper. You'd still get this. But if they just melted the chocolate and took it out of temper, first of all, the water in the strawberry, if it wasn't completely dry, would cause the shell to crack and you'd get sugar bloom. It would be a nasty mess and not pleasant to eat.
The texture of the chocolate is firm, but not so hard. It breaks easily, but it maintains its shape and you still get all that rich, robust chocolate flavor. Tempering chocolate is the process of heating chocolate up to a certain temperature and cooling it slightly. This changes the structure of the chocolate itself so that when it cools and dries, it hardens.
Okay. Number one, chocolate does not dry. There's no water in chocolate. Chocolate does not dry as it cools down. Tempering has nothing to do with drying, right? The cocoa butter crystallizes in one of a number of forms. Tempering is the process of making sure that as the chocolate cools down, the correct form of crystal is created, right? And it turns out that as we cool it down, when chocolate is in temper and we're holding it, there's probably only 5% of the crystals are in the right form. It's just these crystals dominate. And as the chocolate continues to cool down, those crystals will dominate and they will form a lattice and a structure that will force most of the other cocoa butter in the chocolate to crystallize in the right form. I mean, there are almost always lower form crystals, 4, 3, and 2, in chocolate, especially, while it's still cooling down. And that's one of the reasons why chocolate will change texture over the course of the first days and the first weeks. If you have something that is just tempered as opposed to something that's a week later, you'll notice some differences in terms of the melt. And that has to do with lower form crystals, which over time are converting themselves into form 5 crystals. But number one, there's no water in chocolate. Chocolate does not dry out. I'm sorry, chef.
To a beautiful snappy texture. When you temper a couverture chocolate, especially, you're still gonna get that gloss and snap because of the high fat content. That's what you want. Right. Let's see.
So here's an important point about this. If you're a chocolate maker, especially a 2-ingredient chocolate maker. So what crystallizes is the cocoa butter. And if you have a chocolate for which there is a relatively low cocoa butter content, right, it is hard to get the proper crystals to form, the proper amount of crystals to form, and then to mix those crystals evenly through the chocolate, right? That's the problem associated with a lower cocoa fat content chocolate. I mean, I understand why people want to have a 2-ingredient chocolate. They don't want anything added to it that might dilute the flavor, but adding enough cocoa butter to make your life easy, especially if you're using a continuous tempering machine, right, is, I think, really, really important, to consider.
If we can get an audible on the chocolate snap. You get that crunch.
So it's well tempered.
White chocolate. There's a lot of debate around white chocolate, with the consensus being that it's not actually chocolate.
Completely wrong. Completely wrong. There may be a lot of debate. The debate is among people who are non-professionals. People who are professionals who understand the rules and regulations around chocolate will say that white chocolate is really chocolate. And this is a pet peeve. And this is a place where the research team who at Epicurious, and there is a research team at Epicurious, didn't do their homework on this product. White chocolate is legally chocolate. Right. If you go to this Code of Federal Regulations 21.163, I don't remember the subpart for white chocolate. It says if your cocoa derived product contains the following ingredients, right, and it can be called white chocolate. So there is a legal definition for white chocolate. As long as the product you're eating meets that legal definition, it is legally chocolate and it is legally white chocolate. It's really chocolate, right? I'll stop there.
Whatever side of the debate you're on, it's technically a confectionery made with milk solids, cocoa butter, and sugar. So that means that it
is, but legally it's chocolate.
Has the cocoa butter, which has been removed from other types of real chocolate, but none of the...
Other types of real chocolate. It's removed from cocoa mass, cocoa liquor.
Cocoa solids that give other types of chocolate their color and distinct flavor. It's essentially cocoa butter flavored with milk solids and other things. Rumor has it that it was developed as a way to use up excess milk powder that was left over after World War I that was no longer in high demand.
So it turns out that white chocolate was introduced by Nestle in 1936 or 1937. And actually, it did have to do with let's find a way to be able to use up cocoa butter. And also, it was used as a milk delivery vehicle. Originally, one of the selling points for white chocolate is that it contained a lot of milk, and if you ate enough white chocolate, you could get a serving. You get servings of dairy from eating white chocolate. At least that's what it is that the folks at Nestle's original marketing had to say about this.
There are some high quality types of white chocolate out there. They typically have a more yellow color, and that's because cocoa butter has a naturally yellow hue. Lower quality versions can have more milk solids, which gives them a whiter color.
Okay, so I would disagree here entirely. I mean, there are three flavoring components in a white chocolate. You have the sugar as a flavoring component, so different kinds of sugar will give your white chocolate a different flavor. And then you have the milk that you're using. So if you're using a skim milk powder as opposed to a whole milk powder, as opposed to a full cream powder, you'll get a very, very different flavor in your white chocolate and in your milk chocolate, right? Obviously. And then there's also the cocoa butter itself. So if I'm using an undeodorized cocoa butter, and a natural cocoa butter, it will be yellower. The yellow comes from beta carotene pigments, which naturally occur in the cacao beans. And when you're pressing the non-fat solids from the fat, the beta carotene stays behind in the cocoa butter, and that's what it is that colors it yellow. Now you can use non-heinous chemical products like diatomaceous earth as a filter, which will remove some of that. Or what you can do is you can use a solvent-based extraction method to get rid of the color as well. But it's not necessarily the milk that's providing the color to the white chocolate, the milk solids that are providing the color to the white chocolate.
Color and a sweeter flavor.
So lactose is not as sweet as table sugar as sucrose is. And so you'd have to balance out the sugar with the milk and look at how much lactose there was in the milk sugars there were to figure out the ratio. And generally, in almost all white chocolates, there's so much more sugar than there is milk that a change in the quality of milk wouldn't have much influence on the sweetness.
It's soft because it's not getting any of that firmness from the cocoa solids. It's sweet, it's milky, it's creamy. You don't get any of the bitterness, tartness, acidity, or robust flavor that you expect from.
Okay, so here's a point where I also have to disagree. If you're using a good quality undeodorized cocoa butter, you will get a robust cocoa flavor, right? Maybe not a roasted chocolate flavor. Although, if you look at El Rey Ecoa, I think they do an extremely hard roast on the beans that are used to extract that butter. And it's a very, very, I think, robust chocolate flavor in a white chocolate like Ecoa.
Actual chocolate. It's essentially like
it's really chocolate. Sorry, chef.
Eating a solid piece of sweetened condensed milk.
Absolutely. What is white chocolate? It's sweet fat. That is what white chocolate is. Absolutely. Right. And there are good versions of it and not so good versions of it. We've talked about quality a lot here on The Chocolate Life. I'm not going to demonize anything.
There are actual uses for white chocolate. Some of these include white chocolate pudding, certain desserts and confections, and roasting it.
All right, so I'm glad that they did a shout out to Soma here. I also want to point out that if you look at the standards of identity for white chocolate, they allow the manufacturer to use titanium dioxide. And so especially if you've got a compound chip, a baking morsel that's not actually chocolate, but is using fractionated palm kernel oil, and it's really, 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 really white, there are two ways you get there. One of which is you do a solvent extraction of so maybe hexane or something like that to really, really clean out the cocoa butter and get rid of things, anything that's in it, aromas as well as coloring components. It's filtered out. What you're doing is you add titanium dioxide to the mixture, and which will make it incredibly white.
It's still white chocolate, but the roasting of it caramelizes the milk solids and gives you almost like
also caramelizes the sugar, not just the milk side. You can caramelize the milk independently. You can caramelize the sugar independently. You can take a white chocolate and caramelize everything together. I mean, right. Chef, she's got an amazing resume. I mean, if you go take a look at her background at the Institute of Culinary Education, I'll go put the link to her bio at the ICE website. She's an amazing background. She's worked for amazing people, but I don't think she's ever worked in a pastry kitchen. And I think that shows up. And I don't know that the researchers actually talked with pastry chefs. And so that lack of research, I think, shows up in some of the comments that are being made here.
caramel notes of flavor, a little bit more depth, a little umami, and really help kind of balance out the cloying sweetness of it. Ruby chocolate. Ruby chocolate is made from ruby cacao beans, which are found in
no such thing as a ruby cacao bean. That's a marketing myth made up by Barry Callebaut. Now, I think it's so a ruby cocoa bean is any bean that has the chemical characteristics necessary to go through the ruby process in order to create this pink colored chocolate. So the whole process is about keeping the bean from oxidizing. The beans are naturally purple, right, when they're fresh. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to keep the beans from turning brown. And we do that in fermentation by adding antioxidants. Citric acid is one of the things that's used. And then we do things in the manufacturing process which haven't been disclosed in order to be able to keep the chocolate from browning. And maybe the beans are not roasted, which would make an enormous amount of sense. I think they're using CCN51 in order to do this. It's incredibly well fermented CCN51. It's a good use for CCN51 to do this. Is it the fourth type of chocolate? Not quite sure. It's not legally the fourth type of chocolate yet. Ruby is sold under temporary marketing permits here in the United States. It doesn't have its own category in the standard of identity, although I believe Barry Callebaut is lobbying for that to happen here in the United States. Technically, however, what's interesting is that if you look at the recipe for Ruby, it's technically a milk chocolate recipe because there is dairy, as I recall, in the first version of Ruby that was released. I have tasted what is thought of as a sweet chocolate, so no milk product, although there might have been dairy in it. Really, really interesting. I was visited the Callebaut factory in Visa in like 2018 and had a chance to taste some R&D samples of it. So there could be, I don't think there'll ever be a white chocolate version of Ruby because where would the color come from? But certainly we can make milk chocolate versions and what we think of as sweet or dark chocolate versions.
Ecuador, Brazil, and the Ivory Coast. While the actual production process is kept a very tightly held secret, it's speculated that the ruby chocolate is produced by either unfermenting or very lightly fermenting the cacao beans.
That's true.
Defatting them and treating them with an acid that may help enhance the natural color.
Right, so it doesn't enhance the natural color, it keeps it from turning brown. Now, if there is defatting, it's done in the factory, but what we need to do is we need to figure out how to keep the beans from oxidizing at the farm level during post-harvest processing. So this whole trying to retain the pink things happens much earlier on in the process than where defatting would happen, which would be in the factory.
A lot of traditional chocolatiers think that this is just a marketing ploy, not necessarily a true chocolate. The flavor on this is a little bit sweeter. I'm not sure if I think it's a real chocolate. It reminds me more of white chocolate in texture. It feels creamy and richer on the palate. It doesn't have any of that bitterness, but you do get a weird citrusy flavor that's evocative of raw chocolate, but almost in a cloying kind of way. It also has notes of raspberry or some kind of red fruit, but it is very milky overall.
That's why it's the color it is. I mean, when you think about a pink chocolate, you think about red fruit. And so the flavors are evocative of strawberry and raspberry sort of mixed together. And that was a deliberate. I mean, Valrhona had this problem. They created something called Dulce, and they called it blonde chocolate, right? And one of the reasons why it didn't take off is, what is the flavor of blonde? We think of, blonde hair. That's usually the place where blonde is associated with it. We have a smell associated perhaps with hair, but there's no flavor associated with blonde. And that's one of the reasons why ruby as a moniker was chosen, because it's evocative of the overall flavor profile, right? The acidity is a red fruit acidity.
While this is called a chocolate, it doesn't hit those same flavor notes that you get from all the other types of chocolate. The robustness, the bitterness, the depth of flavor, the tannins, but it still tastes good. Natural cocoa powder. Cocoa powder is the true essence of chocolate flavor. You see it in the grocery store.
Disagree with that. The true essence of chocolate flavor is chocolate liquor. Just disagree.
And it can be used in tons of applications. Natural cocoa powder comes from roasted cacao beans that have been processed. The beans are cracked into nibs and then ground into a paste, which is essentially an emulsion of cocoa solids suspended in cocoa butter.
So it's not an emulsion, it's a suspension.
When the cocoa butter is extracted from that emulsion, you're left with the cocoa solids, which are then ground into a fine powder, making cocoa powder. Cocoa powder can be used in brownies, frostings, and savory applications like a dry rub for meat. On its own, the flavor of cocoa powder is very sharp, and because the texture is so fine, the powder really coats your whole mouth. You also get notes of citrus, and you really get the character of the chocolate coming through.
Okay, so this is a natural cocoa powder, unalkalized, and so the flavors it will have are taken up from whatever the flavor of the original beans would have, modified by the roasting. So there is an acidity to it, not necessarily a fruitiness to it, just to be clear. But it can be very, very fruity. Again, it depends upon the beans that were used, how the beans were fermented and dried, how they were roasted, how everything that goes up to the making it. And as a matter of fact, the science of making cocoa powder is incredible. And the kinds of flavors that can come out of a cocoa powder are amazing because of the understanding of the science.
It's much better used in a baking application like chocolate cake. Oh, look, we have two applications, chocolate frosting and chocolate cake. Oh yeah, that's what life is all about. Cocoa powder doesn't have any sugar on its own. When you add it to an application that has some sweetness, you can taste a lot of the different flavor notes in it. You get more of the citrus, a little acid, some of the tannins. You get a lot more of the nuance of the chocolate flavor in the buttercream and the cake. Because cocoa powder is so fine and dry, it's great in frostings because when it's whipped in, it makes the structure much tighter. Dutch processed cocoa powder. Dutch processed cocoa powder is cocoa powder that has been alkalized using a Dutch process. Dutch process.
All right, so you can't use the name of the process and the definition of the process. The reason why it's called Dutch process is it was invented in the Netherlands by the Van Houtens, who are also patenters of the cocoa butter, the hydraulic cocoa butter press. Right. So we process the cacao with an alkali. That alkali neutralizes the acidity. That's the point. And the natural cocoa powder has got some acidity. If we alkalize it, we get rid of the acidity. That's the primary reason for doing it. It also chemically changes the cocoa powder, so that makes it easier to mix in with liquid. So that is a bonus. The reason why we're removing the fat, number one, is so the fat doesn't float to the top of the drink that I'm using. So that's why the cocoa butter press was invented, is to reduce the fat, so that we could make better chocolate from it. The cocoa powder here is, we can play with the color and the flavor of the cocoa powder by changing which of the basic alkalis that we might use, which of the bases we might use, the base alkalis we use, and then what the contact time is, so how long and what the concentration of the alkali is. We can have an amazing amount of control over both the color and the flavor of alkalized cocoa powders, based on, again, our understanding of the science behind things.
Cocoa powder was invented in 1828 by a Dutch chemist and chocolatier who added alkaline salts to his cocoa powder. He did this to make the cocoa powder less bitter and also more water soluble. It can change the color and the flavor of your final product, so it's best to double check your recipe to make sure which type of cocoa powder it calls for.
Okay, so the reason why you're checking the recipe for which kind of cocoa powder is calling for is that some recipes, which have chemical leavening agents in them, right, require the acidity of a natural cocoa powder to activate the chemical leavening agents. So it's important that you take a look at what the recipe requires, right? Because it will determine whether or not your product rises or not. So this is a baked good, anything that requires leavening, it's usually not an issue for other things. The chemical activity is not usually an issue for other things that has to do with flavor, but specifically the difference between natural powder and an alkalized, a Dutch process powder, and alkalized powder, it becomes critical when it comes to leavened goods and baking.
It almost tastes more like a chocolate bar than the natural cocoa powder. It's less acidic.
Right. It tastes more cocoa-y, right, and more roasted, and that's the whole process. I mean, most chocolate, right, will have been conched to get rid of the acidity mechanically through heat and through agitation, and what is going on here. So this chemical process is used to get rid of the acidity. In a way, it does what conching, some of what conching does in terms of flavor development, just incredibly quickly, but it's also indiscriminate. Not only does it get rid of the acidity, but there are a whole lot of chemicals which are good for your health, which just get completely, the levels get completely destroyed as a part of the alkalization process. So do need to know. But yes, a Dutch processed cocoa powder is going to taste more like a chocolate bar. You can take a cocoa powder, a Dutch powder, and add cocoa butter, right, and refine them together to make sure the particle size is small enough, and you can make a chocolate bar.
Less of the citrus notes, but more of that deep chocolatey flavor that you get kind of coming up at the back end. It's actually kind of pleasant. One great and lesser known use for Dutch processed cocoa powder is red velvet cake. Traditional red velvet cake did not use red food color. The brick red color was a result of the higher alkaline in the Dutch processed cocoa powder being mixed into the batter. But today,
it's the other way around. A Dutch processed cocoa powder. Oh, I'm sorry. It's higher alkalinity. Absolutely. I'm sorry. It's lower acid.
Today, most bakers add red food color to make it a brighter red like you see here. The red food color doesn't affect the taste of the cake, but you still get that depth of flavor from the alkalized cocoa powder. If you didn't know that there was cocoa powder in red velvet, you might not be able to pick it out, but once you know that, you can kind of get those mellow chocolatey notes behind the other flavors. Black cocoa powder. Black cocoa powder is cocoa powder that has gone through the Dutch process multiple times.
I don't necessarily know that this is the case. It may be the case, but what is the point is that black cocoa powder is very heavily alkalized, and it could have a pH around 10 or higher. So it is a very strongly alkalized cocoa powder. However it's done, I don't necessarily know that you have to go through repeated steps in order to be able to get that color.
Resulting in a higher alkaline level and a darker color. It also has a milder flavor than even Dutch process. Black cocoa powder is great because you can get a much darker color without...
This distinction between black cocoa powder and Dutch powder is nonsensical because black powder is a form of alkalized cocoa powder. They're both the same thing.
Without having to add any food color or excessive amounts of cocoa powder. The heavy processing changes the flavor dramatically from natural to Dutch processed to black. It still has notes of chocolate, but it's very different. You're not getting any of the acidity. You're not getting so much of the citrus. It actually doesn't taste like cocoa powder in the same way, but it has
like
a
Oreo
very
cookies.
specific taste that you probably are familiar with. Oreo cookies.
Yep.
Oreo cookies are made with black cocoa powder, giving them their distinct color that you can see on the outside of the cookie. Black cocoa powder is also used in a lot of ice cream sandwiches to give the outer cookie that dark color. This is definitely gonna get in my teeth. Sweet cocoa powder.
So again, this is not another type of chocolate. This is just cocoa powder to which sugar has been added, right? So, it's not a type of chocolate. Number one, it's cocoa powder. The clue is in the name. It's not chocolate, but it's not a thing. alkalized cocoa powder and natural cocoa powder are things in the standard of identity. Sweet cocoa powder is not a legally defined term. How much sugar, right? We don't know. Not a thing.
Sweet cocoa powder is just natural cocoa powder made with sugar and sometimes the addition of vanilla. It can be easily used in recipes like hot chocolate and frosting.
And there's no reason why I couldn't use an alkalized cocoa powder. I don't need to use a natural cocoa powder with this.
Because it's already got a sweetener added to it. It's pretty tasty, but it is pretty sweet. Another thing that it's great for is dusting desserts, like topping this cheesecake. It's better than adding just natural cocoa powder because that might add a little bit of bitterness, which we don't want. But you don't want...
Well, you might want bitterness on top of your sweet cheesecake. I mean, it is a recipe decision and it's based on the chef, right? So again, a distinction. I think that's an important distinction.
You want to just swap it out in your recipe for natural cocoa powder because it is very sweet. So always be sure to adjust your recipe or use it very sparingly.
There's another reason why you might want to be very careful with this is that most commercially available powdered sugars have cornstarch in them, and cornstarch is a thickener. So if you use a sweetened cocoa powder, which has got powdered sugar added to it, then it could completely affect the texture of the recipe that you're using, especially if it was cooked. It would get much denser.
So that was all of the chocolate that we could possibly get in one place. Thanks for tuning in. I hope you learned a lot and get to try some of these amazing preparations that we made today. Feel free to leave a comment and let us know what you want to see next time on The Big Guide. I'm Adrienne Cheatham, and I hope to see you soon.
All right, so that was it. That was my take on the big guide to chocolate over at epicurious.com. And we're a little over the hour. I do want to say thank you very much to TheChocolateLifeLIVE, SAC, who's asking me to translate this into Spanish. I will have to see. It's not something which is automatically done, I don't think. I will have to see if it's something that I can figure out, if there's a way to do it relatively inexpensively. Or if the people who are TheChocolateLifeLIVE know somebody who is good at translation, please let me know, and I will go figure out a way to take a translated guide and add it as captions to the video after the fact, if that's possible. But I want to thanks for the suggestion. Absolutely, if I were to be able to do automatic translation into Spanish, I would definitely offer it as a capability to do that. And with that, I want to say thank you very much to everybody who joined me today. I'm here on The Chocolate Life Live. We're taking a look at the 15 different types of chocolate that are mentioned in the Epicurious guide. What I wanted to do is I wanted to point it out that I actually think about this in a very different way. So we have a number of things that a chef thought of as chocolate that aren't actually chocolate, right? These would be cocoa beans, cocoa nibs. She didn't mention cocoa butter, right? Because cocoa butter is within the standards of identity for cocoa products. We don't think of it as chocolate on its own. Now, there is no such thing as sweet cocoa powder, but natural alkalized black, they're not they're not chocolate, right? They are ingredients which can be used in a variety of ways. One of the ways in which a cocoa powder might be used is reconstituted with cocoa butter in order to make a chocolate. Yay. Right. We then have adjectives and modifiers. So couverture chocolate, right, is not a type of chocolate, right? It is a term that refers to a particular type of fluidity, right? The couverture chocolate can be a white chocolate. It can be a milk chocolate. It can be a sweet chocolate, which includes what we think of as dark chocolate. But in and of its own, its couverture is not a type of chocolate. The same thing is true of ruby. I don't think of ruby as a type of chocolate. It's not the fourth type of chocolate. It's just a modifier that says I have either a milk chocolate or a sweet chocolate, a dark chocolate recipe. And both in either one of those things can have this color, right? And ruby is all about how do I get to a particular color of chocolate. Again, a modeling chocolate is about an application. I take unsweetened chocolate or sweetened chocolate. I add corn syrup, right? Perhaps other ingredients. No unbound water. So I might use a glucose syrup for a texture difference. It will absorb moisture differently than a corn syrup might. I could throw dextrose powder in there as well to play with the texture. It will absorb moisture differently and alter the way the modeling chocolate is put together. But I can't go to the standard of identity in the Code of Federal Regulations and go, oh, right, here is a definition for modeling chocolate. Doesn't exist. The same thing is true about Mexican table chocolate. As I said earlier, I think of it as a stand-in for all rustic and flavored chocolate. There is no type of chocolate which is called Mexican table chocolate. And a lot of what people think of as, I think, Mexican table chocolate is used for making hot chocolate. It's used more as a beverage than it is for cooking, at least in my experience. And if you've got a different experience, please let me know. And then finally, when it comes to chocolate, right, we actually have what I think of as, right, the different types of chocolate, right? And literally they could be broken down into, is there sugar added, right? And is there dairy added? So we have unsweetened chocolate. We call that chocolate liquor, cocoa mass, sometimes cocoa paste. We use it as an ingredient. Baking chocolate is a form of unsweetened chocolate. It tends to be not as highly conched. We want to retain the acidity so that what it does is it activates the leavening agent in whatever it is that we're cooking. And I don't need to refine it quite as much, because as long as the particle size is below the particle size of flour, I'm never going to be able to taste the texture of the baking chocolate. So unsweetened chocolate, these are the way things paste. And then paste is there. I don't take cocoa mass or cocoa paste and melt it into liquor. That's not the way it works, right? Anything which has got a high enough fat content, I warm it up to a certain point and the butter is going to soften and it's going to become liquid. It's just a question of how fluid it is, right? There's no difference. Okay, I have sweet chocolate, right? So this is chocolate to which the primary addition is going to be sugar, right? So we have semi-sweet. For some reason, if we come over here and look at the lists of chocolate, we only have semi-sweet chocolate here, German's chocolate, and dark chocolate. Bittersweet was mentioned in passing, and Chef got it absolutely right. There's no legal definition. There's no distinction between semi-sweet chocolate and bittersweet chocolate. It's up to the manufacturers what it means. But technically, what we think of as dark chocolate, semi-sweet chocolate, bittersweet chocolate, and what is called German's chocolate all fit within the context of what is called sweet chocolate, just the amount of sugar for the most part. Then we have milk chocolate. Milk chocolate contains one or more dairy ingredients, and for the most part right now, these are dairy milk ingredients. So technically, almond milk chocolate is not milk. So there are some questions. The standards of identity are really written around dairy derived milk as opposed to plant-based milks. And then we have white chocolate. And to lead off as I do, yes, white chocolate is really chocolate. There's no doubt about it. There should be no controversy over it. It's there in the standard of identity. And so I want to let you know that what I have done for those in the US, if we scroll down to the Chocolate Life Live post for the live stream today, there is a link directly to the Code of Federal Regulations. It's right here. It says Federal Register Request Access. That's because the page is just badly coded and I can't pull off all the information I want out of the post. I also went to the Food and Agriculture Organization, the FAO, as part of the World Health Organization, and I downloaded the definition of cocoa and chocolate from the Codex Alimentarius. And the Codex Alimentarius is the primary rules and regulations which apply outside of the United States. There's some differences locally. For example, the EU, they can add up to 5% non-cocoa butter fats and still call it chocolate, as long as it's declared on the label. In the UK, I don't think you can call it chocolate, for example. So there are differences in some parts of the world about what it is that's going on. And that's it for today. I want to thank everybody very, very much, especially those of you who listened through to the end. And to say that, please, you can go into the comments here on YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook. You can throw in your questions. You can go to thechocolatelife.com. If you scroll down, we can see that there is a comment section. No comments yet. You can throw your comments into the page here. In order to be able to comment, you need to click on the join button. You need to become a member. This is to reduce spam. There is always a free, since 2008, when the Chocolate Life was first stood up, there's always a free member to join. You don't need to pay. But of course, I appreciate all the support that anybody can give, whether it's just a $5 a month subscription or whatever it is. I appreciate everything that you do to show your support here. I want to say that on Friday, we're coming to the last Chocolate Life Live of the year. And so Friday is going to be a session devoted to looking back at 2022 and looking forward to 2023. I am going to be sending out a newsletter tomorrow to every single subscriber, whether a free subscriber or a premium subscriber. And you will get a preview of what it is that I'm going to be talking about on Friday, and just an idea to just see where it is, what it is that I'm thinking and what it is that I'm planning for the upcoming year. One final note, I want to give a shout out to Lassa Skinner, who's connecting from LinkedIn, who says, "Great session, Clay. Thanks. I can't help but hear the similarities with making cheese." Lassa, Lassa is my ex-sister-in-law, and she was one of the founding members of like the preeminent cheese magazine, certainly in the United States culture, if not in the world. And she and I have been talking about cheese and chocolate and all these kinds of stuff. And, Lassa, perhaps what we could do early in the new year is let's do a cheese and chocolate, just to do a dedicated cheese and chocolate session. I would love to go and make that happen. And perhaps, we'll figure it out. So, we haven't seen each other in person in too long. And so it'd be great to get together and make that happen. I'll even come up to Connecticut or Rhode Island to see you. And with that, again, everybody, thanks very much. If I don't catch you between now and the end of the week, everybody, please have a safe and happy holidays. And I will be seeing you all in 2023. And with that, please remember, everybody, if you're working with chocolate and you're not having fun, I think you're doing it wrong. So everybody, have fun with chocolate.